Imagine buying a train ticket, saying goodbye to your family on the platform, boarding the car under the eyes of dozens of witnesses, and then simply disappearing as if you had never existed. No body at the arrival, no trace along the tracks. Only the deafening silence of a mystery that would defy logic for nearly 7 decades. And when the truth finally emerges, it comes from a place so impossible, so disturbing, that it raises more questions than answers about what really happened on that fateful journey. Before we dive into this story that will challenge everything you think you know about disappearances, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the case you are about to discover is one of the most bewildering in American railway history. This is not just the story of a woman who disappeared on a train. It is the story of how something can be hidden in plain sight for 67 years, of how the truth can remain sealed and silent while the world keeps turning, and of how sometimes the most frightening mysteries are those that find their answers too late to matter. The story begins in an era when America was living the height of the golden post-war years, when trains were the vital artery connecting cities and lives, and when disappearing from inside a crowded car seemed absolutely impossible. Dorothy Ann Miller was 28 years old in October 1957, and for anyone who knew her in Burlington, Vermont, she represented everything that the 1950s decade celebrated in a young American woman. At 5 feet 5 inches tall, with wavy brown hair that she always pinned with pearl clips, and green eyes that reflected a quiet intelligence, Dorothy possessed that discreet beauty that ages with grace. Her style was impeccable without being ostentatious. Cinched waist dresses in pastel tones, wool cardigans, always polished medium-heeled shoes, and a small brown leather purse that she carried everywhere. Born on April 10, 1929, in Burlington itself, Dorothy was the only child of Richard Miller, a respected accountant who worked for a local firm, and Eleanor Miller, a former piano teacher who dedicated her life to raising her daughter after marriage. She grew up in a 2-story Victorian house on Pine Street, painted pale yellow with white trim, with a porch where her father smoked a pipe on summer evenings, while her mother watered the hydrangea beds. Dorothy was the type of child that teachers adored, studious, polite, always with her homework impeccably completed. She graduated from Burlington High School in 1947 as class speaker, her speech about the future we will build together being remembered for years. While many of her classmates married immediately after graduation, Dorothy had other plans. She secured a partial scholarship to Middlebury College, where she studied English literature and library science. In 1951, at 22 years old, Dorothy returned to Burlington with her degree and a quiet determination to make a difference. She got a job as an assistant librarian at the Fletcher Free Public Library, a position that delighted her from the first day. The library, an imposing stone building in the city center, became her second home. Dorothy knew every hallway, every shelf, every obscure title buried in the less visited sections. She had a gift for recommending the right book to the right person, an intuition about what someone needed to read, even when the person themselves did not know. The children of Burlington adored her. Dorothy organized story time every Wednesday at 3 in the afternoon, sitting in the large green leather armchair in the children's section, with a dozen children sitting in a semicircle on the carpet at her feet. She read with different voices for each character, made dramatic pauses at the right moments, and always ended with a question to stimulate the children's imagination. "And what do you think happened next?" she would ask, her green eyes shining as little hands eagerly rose with elaborate theories. Dorothy lived with her parents in the house on Pine Street. At 28 years old in 1957, she was still single, a situation that was beginning to generate worried comments among her mother's friends at the gardening club. It was not for lack of suitors. Dorothy was intelligent, beautiful, kind, and came from a good family. But she had standards, and none of the boys from Burlington seemed to measure up to them. She wanted conversations that went beyond weather and sports. She wanted someone who understood why she could spend hours lost in a book. She wanted a partner, not just a husband. Her routine was as predictable as the seasons. She woke at 6:30 in the morning, had breakfast with her parents at 7, toast with her mother's homemade raspberry jam, coffee with milk, orange juice. She walked the 15 minutes to the library, always arriving 10 minutes before the official opening at 9. She lunched on a sandwich she brought from home, usually sitting in the small garden behind the library when the weather permitted, reading while eating. She worked until 5:30 in the afternoon, walked back home, had dinner with the family at 6:30 sharp. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, Dorothy participated in a book club that she herself had founded, meeting with 5 other women at the library after work hours. They discussed everything from Jane Austen to the new Beat Generation authors who were beginning to emerge. On Fridays, she occasionally went to the movies with her best friend since childhood, Catherine Walsh, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. On Saturdays, she helped her mother with household chores and shopped at the city market. Sundays were reserved for church in the morning, family lunch, and quiet afternoons reading or writing in her diary. Dorothy had kept a diary since she was 13 years old. Hardcover notebooks with her elegant handwriting filling page after page with observations about her life, reflections on the books she read, thoughts about the world around her. She kept them in a cedar box in her bedroom closet, an intimate chronicle of 15 years of her inner life. There was a gentle melancholy in Dorothy that those close to her recognized. She loved Burlington, loved her family, loved her work. But there were moments when she looked out the library window at the Green Mountains in the distance and felt a restlessness she could not name, a feeling that there was more world out there waiting to be explored, more experiences waiting to be lived. She had never left Vermont, never seen the ocean, never walked the streets of a big city like New York or Boston. Her parents, Richard and Eleanor, were protective of her in a way that was common for parents of an only daughter in the 1950s. Richard, a methodical man of 54 years with gray hair combed back and metal-framed glasses, saw the world through numbers and order. Eleanor, 51 years old, with light brown hair beginning to gray at the temples, governed the house with gentle efficiency. They loved Dorothy deeply, but they also kept her close, perhaps too close. Catherine Walsh, Dorothy's best friend, was her opposite in many ways. Impetuous where Dorothy was cautious, talkative where Dorothy was contemplative. Catherine had married at 20 to a doctor, had 3 children in rapid succession, and lived a domestic life that she clearly loved, but that also exhausted her. She envied Dorothy's freedom, while Dorothy secretly envied Catherine's family. The work at the library brought Dorothy a deep satisfaction. Her supervisor, Mr. Henry Fletcher, 62 years old, chief librarian for 30 years, considered her his protégé. He saw in her someone who could eventually take over his position when he retired. Dorothy had a natural talent for organization, an impressive memory for the cataloging system, and most importantly, a genuine love for books and for the people who sought them. There were small pleasures that punctuated Dorothy's life. The smell of old books, the sound of rain against the library's tall windows, the feeling of discovering a rare volume at a garage sale and bringing it to the library's collection. The moment when a child who struggled with reading suddenly found the right book, and their eyes lit up with understanding. The taste of the hot chocolate her mother made on cold winter nights. The beauty of autumn leaves transforming the mountains into a tapestry of gold and crimson. But there were also unexpressed frustrations. The feeling that her life was already completely mapped out. The awareness that Burlington, however beloved, was too small and familiar. The desire for adventure that she rarely admitted, even to herself. Dorothy read about distant places, about extraordinary lives, about women who defied conventions, and part of her wondered if she would spend her entire life just reading about such things instead of living them. In October 1957, an opportunity arose that seemed, finally, a chance to expand her world, even if only a little. The Vermont State Library was organizing a 3-day conference in Albany, New York, about new cataloging methods and preservation of historical documents. Mr. Fletcher recommended Dorothy to participate, seeing this as a professional development opportunity. For Dorothy, it was more than that. It was a chance to travel, to see a new city, to be among people who shared her passion for library science, but came from different places and perspectives. When she told her parents about the conference, the reaction was mixed. Richard was reluctant, his daughter traveling alone, but Eleanor, surprisingly, supported the idea. Richard, she is 28 years old. It is a respectable work trip, not an irresponsible escapade. After several days of discussion, they agreed, although with obvious concerns. Dorothy was excited in a way she rarely allowed others to see. She planned carefully, chose her best dresses, prepared her small navy blue travel suitcase, made a list of everything she needed to take. The conference would begin on October 15th, a Tuesday. She would take the train on the morning of October 14th, a Monday, arriving in Albany in the late afternoon with enough time to settle into the hotel before the opening dinner. In the days leading up to the trip, Dorothy was visibly lighter, more animated. Catherine noticed the change. "You are radiant," she said during their last lunch together before the trip. "It is just a conference about book cataloging, Dorothy." "I know," Dorothy replied, smiling. "But it is different. It is something of my own, you know. Something beyond the routine." Catherine held her friend's hand. "You deserve this. You deserve more than this. Promise. You will have fun?" "I promise," said Dorothy. It was a promise she would never have the chance to keep. In that last week before the trip, Dorothy was doing more than just preparing for a conference. She was, unknowingly, living her last days of normalcy. Her last dinners with her parents, her last hours in the library she loved, her last walks through the familiar streets of Burlington. Everything was about to end in a way that no one could predict or comprehend. The weather was perfect, that last week, that kind of New England autumn that seems straight out of a postcard, with fresh and clear air, deep blue sky, and leaves at their peak of color before the final fall. Dorothy walked to work on Friday, October 11th, breathing deeply the autumn air, not knowing she was counting her last days in that city that had seen her grow. She spent the weekend with her family, helping her mother prepare apple preserves, sitting on the porch with her father while he read the newspaper, writing in her diary about her expectations for the trip. "I feel like something is changing," she wrote on Sunday night, October 13th, "as if this trip were the first step toward what? I do not know. But I feel that my life will not be exactly the same afterward." She could not know how terribly correct those words would be, though not in the way she imagined. Dorothy Miller was about to embark on a journey that would take her not to a new phase of her life, but to the end of it. And the mystery of her fate would remain closed literally sealed for 67 years. The morning of October 14th, 1957 dawned cold but clear in Burlington, Vermont. The thermometer marked 7 degrees Celsius at 6 in the morning, with a forecast to reach 15 degrees in the afternoon. It was a typical New England autumn day, with a deep blue, cloudless sky and the air carrying that particular smell of fallen leaves and damp earth. Dorothy woke at 5:45, earlier than usual. Not by necessity, her train only departed at 9:30, but by a mixture of excitement and nervousness that had made sleep light during the night. She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit she had planned days before: a navy blue wool dress with a white collar, a beige cardigan, nylon stockings, and her most comfortable black low-heeled shoes for traveling. She pinned her brown hair in an elegant bun, applied a little pale pink lipstick, and put on her pearl earrings, a B.O. birthday gift from her parents the previous year. At 6:30, she went down for breakfast. Eleanor had prepared a special meal: pancakes with maple syrup, bacon, scrambled eggs, fresh coffee. Richard was already sitting at the table, reading the Burlington Free Press. He lowered the newspaper when Dorothy entered. "Did you sleep well, dear?" asked Eleanor, serving pancakes on Dorothy's plate. "Reasonably," Dorothy replied, sitting down. "I was a little anxious." Richard carefully folded the newspaper. "Are you sure about this trip, Dorothy? It is still not too late to change your mind." "Richard," Eleanor intervened gently, "we have already discussed this." I know," he said, adjusting his glasses. "It is just that Albany is a big city, and you have never traveled alone." Dorothy took her father's hand. "Father, I am 28 years old. I will be with fellow librarians the entire time. The hotel is 2 blocks from the convention center. I will call as soon as I arrive. I promise." He nodded, but the worry did not leave his eyes. Years later, he would remember this moment with a pain so intense he could barely breathe. How did he not insist more? How did he let her go? The breakfast proceeded with light conversation about the conference, about what Dorothy expected to learn, about when she would return. It was planned that she would return on Thursday, October 17th, on the afternoon train, arriving in Burlington around 7 in the evening. 4 days. It seemed so simple, so safe. At 8:45, Richard loaded Dorothy's small navy blue suitcase into the trunk of his 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air. The suitcase contained 3 dresses, underwear, toiletries, an extra pair of shoes, and the notebook she would use for notes during the conference. Dorothy also carried her brown leather purse containing her wallet with $47 in cash, her train ticket, identification documents, lipstick, tissues, a small hand, mirror, and a book, an edition of The Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway that she was rereading. The Burlington train station was only a 10-minute drive from the Miller house. It was a red brick building constructed in 1900, with a large clock in the central tower and 2 platforms serving the Central Vermont Railway line. The station was moderately busy that Monday morning. Businessmen in dark suits carrying briefcases, some women with children, a group of college students, probably returning to their colleges after the weekend. Richard parked in front of the station at 9:05. All 3 got out of the car. Richard took Dorothy's suitcase from the trunk. Eleanor adjusted the silk scarf around her daughter's neck. "Do not forget to wear this if the train has too much air conditioning," she said, her eyes already shining with tears she tried to hold back. "Mother, it is only 3 days," said Dorothy, but she hugged her mother tightly. They entered the station. The interior smelled of motor oil, coffee from the small kiosk, and something vaguely metallic characteristic of train stations. The schedule board showed that train 147 to Albany was on time. Departure scheduled for 9:30 from Platform 2. Dorothy went to the ticket office where she presented her pre-purchase ticket. A round-trip second-class ticket to Albany. Total cost of $8.50. "Platform 2, miss," said the attendant, a middle-aged man named George Thornton, who knew the Miller family by sight. "The train is already there. You can board whenever you want." At 9:15, Dorothy and her parents walked through the passage that led to Platform 2. The train was there, its diesel locomotive exhaling light smoke, 6 passenger cars, and 2 baggage cars. It was a regular Central Vermont Railway train making the Burlington-Albany route with stops in several smaller towns along the way. The journey would take approximately 5 hours. Dorothy was not alone on the platform. There were perhaps 20 other people waiting to board. The station was not crowded, but it was not an empty train either. Among the passengers were Arthur Pemberton, a 43-year-old agricultural implements salesman going to a trade fair in Albany. He noticed Dorothy because she was standing near him, and he would later remember that she seemed calm and well-groomed, nothing unusual. Margaret and Thomas Brennan, an elderly couple of 71 and 74 years old respectively, visiting their son who lived in Schenectady. They briefly chatted with Dorothy about the beautiful weather. James Whitmore, a 20-year-old student from the University of Vermont, returning after visiting family. He was reading a book and did not pay much attention to the other passengers, but vaguely remembered a young woman in a blue dress, Sarah Chen, a 35-year-old teacher going to Albany for an educational workshop. She and Dorothy exchanged polite smiles on the platform. The train conductor, William Bradford, 56 years old, a veteran of 30 years in the railways, was checking tickets on the platform and helping elderly passengers or those with heavy luggage. He would clearly remember Dorothy because she was one of the last to board. At 9:25, 5 minutes before departure, Dorothy turned to her parents. Eleanor hugged her again, squeezing her tightly. "Call as soon as you arrive," Eleanor whispered. "I will. Call, Mother. I promise." Richard hugged his daughter, something rare for him who was not demonstrative. "Take care, Dorothy." "I always do, Father." Dorothy picked up her suitcase and her purse. She walked toward the third passenger car where Conductor Bradford was standing. "Good morning, miss," he said, checking her ticket. "Car C, any available seat." "Thank you," Dorothy replied, climbing the 3 metal steps into the car. Richard and Eleanor remained on the platform, watching. Through the window, they could see Dorothy walking through the internal corridor of the car, looking for a seat. She found a spot approximately in the middle of the car, right side near the window. She placed her suitcase in the upper compartment, sat down, and looked out the window. She saw her parents and waved. They waved back. At 9:28, Conductor Bradford walked along the platform making the last call. "All aboard! Departure to Albany." He climbed into the car, closed the external door with a definitive metallic sound. At 9:30 sharp, the train whistle sounded. A long, loud sound that echoed through the station. The train began to move, slowly at first, the steel wheels creaking against the rails. Richard and Eleanor walked along the platform, following the train's movement, waving. Dorothy continued waving through the window, smiling, until the train gained speed, and the platform was left behind. It was the last time Richard and Eleanor Miller saw their daughter. The last time any member of the Miller family saw Dorothy alive. The last image they would have of her would be that one. Her face in the train window, smiling, waving, disappearing in the distance, as the train accelerated southward. The train left the Burlington station at 9:30 and 45 seconds, according to official railway records. It carried 87 passengers distributed in its 6 cars. Dorothy Miller was passenger number 34 on the manifest. Her seat was in car C, approximately in row 12, right side. No one on board had any reason to pay special attention to her. She was just another passenger on a common Monday. Just another anonymous face on a routine journey. Just another young woman traveling alone in 1957, something that was no longer uncommon at that time. But at some point during the next 5 hours, something would happen to Dorothy Miller that would defy all logic. Something so impossible, so unlikely, that when the train finally arrived in Albany at 14:42, Dorothy simply would not be on it anymore. And despite dozens of witnesses, despite a closed train in motion, despite each stop being monitored, no one would be able to explain how she disappeared. The mystery was just beginning. And it would take 67 years for someone to discover where Dorothy Miller really was all that time. Train 147 followed its planned route, making scheduled stops in Vergennes at 10:05, Middlebury at 10:45, and Rutland at 12:15. They were short stops of 5 to 10 minutes each, enough time for passengers to disembark and new ones to board, for railway personnel to check equipment and make crew changes when necessary. During the first hour of travel, everything seemed absolutely normal. The train traversed the autumnal landscape of Vermont, passing by farms where cows grazed, small towns with white churches and colonial houses, and stretches of forest where leaves exploded in colors of gold and red. The interior of Car C was typical of the era. Seats upholstered in dark green velvet, varnished wooden luggage compartments above the windows, Art Deco frosted glass light fixtures on the ceiling. Arthur Pemberton, the salesman who had boarded with Dorothy in Burlington, sat 3 rows ahead of her. Later, he would testify that during the first hour of travel, he occasionally looked back when adjusting himself in his seat, or when reaching for something from his briefcase, and saw Dorothy sitting calmly looking out the window. She seemed to be reading at some moments, and at others simply observing the landscape passing by. Sarah Chen, the teacher, was sitting on the opposite side of the corridor, 2 rows behind Dorothy. She would also remember seeing Dorothy during the beginning of the trip, a quiet young woman who seemed lost in her own thoughts. Conductor William Bradford passed through Car C at approximately 10:20, after the stop in Vergennes, checking tickets of passengers who had boarded at that station. He had no specific reason to check Dorothy's ticket again. He had already checked it in Burlington, but he would remember later having seen her sitting in the middle of the car, reading her book. It was at some point between the stop in Middlebury, 10:45, and the stop in Rutland, 12:15, that Dorothy Miller disappeared. There was no scream. There was no commotion. There was no indication of a problem. The train continued its journey through the mountainous landscape of Vermont, and at some point during that hour-and-a-half stretch, Dorothy simply ceased to be where she was. Arthur Pemberton would later tell investigators that around 11:30, he got up to go to the bathroom at the end of the car. As he walked down the corridor, he casually looked at the seat where Dorothy had been sitting. The seat was empty. Her suitcase was still in the upper compartment. He vaguely remembered seeing a blue suitcase there, but Dorothy was not there. He did not think much about it at the time. People went to the bathroom. People walked to the dining car. People changed seats. There was nothing alarming about an empty seat. Sarah Chen, the teacher, dozed off after the stop in Middlebury. When she woke up, shortly before Rutland, She did not consciously notice that Dorothy had disappeared. Later, under police questioning, she would struggle to remember, but could not say for certain at what exact moment Dorothy disappeared from her field of vision. The train arrived in Rutland at 12:15 on the dot. It was a longer stop of 15 minutes, allowing passengers to get off to buy food, stretch their legs, smoke a cigarette on the platform. Several passengers from Car C temporarily disembarked, including Arthur Pemberton. Conductor Bradford supervised the stop, checking the arrival of luggage and the exchange of some staff members. No one reported anything unusual. No one saw Dorothy get off the train in Rutland. No one saw her on any of the previous stop platforms, but also no one was looking for her. She was just one passenger among dozens, and at that moment, no one had reason to notice her absence. At 12:30, the train departed from Rutland toward the state border, entering the state of New York. The next stop would be Whitehall at 13:25, followed by the final arrival in Albany at 14:42. It was only when the train was approaching Albany, around 14:30, that Dorothy's absence began to become noticeable in a different way, but only for those who knew her personally, and they were not on the train. For the passengers and crew on board, everything remained perfectly normal. The train arrived at Albany's Union Station at 14:42, exactly as scheduled. Passengers began to disembark, collecting their luggage, dispersing through the city. Arthur Pemberton got off, took a taxi to his hotel. Sarah Chen was met by a colleague who was waiting for her on the platform. The Brennans were found by their son. Life continued normally for everyone aboard Train 147, except that Dorothy Miller did not get off, and initially, no one knew this. Dorothy had planned to telephone her parents as soon as she arrived at the hotel. The hotel had been reserved by the conference organization, the Governor Clinton Hotel, a modest but respectable establishment 3 blocks from the station. Dorothy was supposed to check in, go up to her room, and then call home. Her parents expected this phone call around 15:30 or 1600 hours. Richard and Eleanor spent Monday afternoon in a mixture of pride and parental concern. Eleanor cleaned Dorothy's room, changed the sheets, even though they did not need to be changed, just to have something to do. Richard tried to concentrate on work he had brought home, but found himself looking at the clock every 15 minutes. At 1600 hours? The phone had not rung. Eleanor began to get nervous. "Maybe the train is delayed," Richard suggested, although he himself had discreetly called the station and confirmed that Train 147 had arrived in Albany on time. At 1700 hours, the worry was transforming into something heavier. Eleanor called the Governor Clinton Hotel in Albany. The operator transferred her to reception. "Good morning, Governor Clinton Hotel," answered a polite male voice. "Yes, hello. I am calling to check if my daughter checked in. She should have arrived this afternoon. Dorothy Miller." There was a pause while the receptionist checked the register. "One moment, ma'am. I have a reservation for Dorothy Miller, but she has not checked in yet." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Are you sure?" "Yes, ma'am. The reservation is for today through Thursday, but she has not arrived yet. It is not uncommon, however. Sometimes guests arrive later than they plan." Eleanor thanked him and hung up, but her hands were trembling. She told Richard. He tried to stay calm. Maybe she stopped for dinner. Maybe she met someone from the conference and they went to eat something. She will call Eleanor. But he himself did not completely believe that. Dorothy had promised to call as soon as she arrived. She always kept her promises. She was reliable, responsible, careful. At 1800 hours, Richard called the conference organization number that was listed in the documents. Dorothy had left. A secretary answered, informing that the opening dinner was scheduled for 1900 hours at the hotel, but that she had no information about individual participants arriving. At 1930, Richard called the Governor Clinton Hotel again. Dorothy still had not checked in. He asked to speak with a manager. He explained the situation. His daughter had taken the train from Burlington that morning, should have arrived in the afternoon, and was not responding. The NEU manager, a man named Peter Carmichael, was sympathetic, but not particularly alarmed. "Mr. Miller, I understand your concern, but sometimes young people change their plans. Maybe your daughter decided to stay at a different hotel? Or maybe she met friends." "You do not understand," said Richard, his voice becoming tense. "My daughter is not like that. She would have called. Something is wrong." At 2000 hours, Richard called the Burlington police. The officer on duty, Sergeant Donald Murphy, took down the information, but gently explained that an adult who does not arrive at their planned destination after less than 12 hours does not technically constitute a missing person yet. "Sir, she is an adult. Technically, she has the right to change her plans without notifying anyone. Wait until tomorrow morning. If she does not appear or does not call by then, call back." It was a standard response, reasonable even, but devastating for parents who knew their daughter well enough to know that something was terribly wrong. Richard and Eleanor did not sleep that night. They sat in the living room, waiting for the phone to ring. It never rang. On the morning of Tuesday, October 15th, at 700 hours, Richard called the Governor Clinton Hotel again. Dorothy had not appeared during the night. She had not attended the conference opening dinner. Her reservation was intact, but the room empty. At 800 hours, Richard drove to the Fletcher Free Library and spoke with Henry Fletcher, Dorothy's supervisor. He explained the situation. Fletcher was immediately concerned. He had known Dorothy for 6 years and knew she was absolutely reliable. "This is not typical of her," said Fletcher, echoing Richard's thoughts. "She was so excited about this trip. It makes no sense for her to simply not show up." At 900 hours, Richard was back at the Burlington Police Department, this time with more information and more urgency. He spoke with Captain Robert Haynes, Chief of Investigations. Haynes, a 50-year-old man with gray hair and 28 years of experience, listened attentively. "Mr. Miller, I will initiate an investigation," he said. "But I need to ask some questions. Is there any possibility that your daughter planned this? Any boyfriend that you did not approve of? Any reason for her to want to disappear voluntarily?" "No." Richard's response was immediate and definitive. Dorothy did not have a boyfriend. She had no reason to run away. She loved her job, loved our family. Something happened to her. Something bad. Haynes nodded slowly. "I will start by making some calls. When was the last time you saw her?" "Yesterday morning, at 9:30, at the train station. She boarded the train to Albany. We saw her through the window as the train departed." "And are there witnesses that she was on the train?" "She boarded. The conductor checked her ticket. She was there." Haynes picked up the phone and began making calls. First to the Albany police, informing about a possible missing person. Then to the Central Vermont Railway, requesting information about train 147 that departed from Burlington the previous morning. The railway's response came quickly. The district manager, a man named Harold Westbrook, provided the records. Train 147 departed from Burlington at 9:30 with 87 manifested passengers. Arrived in Albany at 14:42. All stops fulfilled without incidents. No problems reported during the trip. "I need to speak with the conductor," said Haynes. William Bradford, the conductor, was contacted at home. He vaguely remembered a young woman in a blue dress who boarded in Burlington. He had checked her ticket. But honestly, he could not say for certain if she was on the train when it arrived in Albany. There were dozens of passengers. He did not track each one individually after checking tickets. Could she have gotten off at one of the EB2 stops? Haynes asked. It is possible, Bradford admitted. People sometimes change their plans, but it would be strange not to notify anyone. Haynes then asked the crucial question. Is it possible that something happened to her while the train was in motion? An accident? Something that no one noticed? Bradford was silent for a moment. Captain, the train was moving at 80 kilometers per hour in some stretches. The doors between cars are locked during movement for safety. The bathrooms are small but checked regularly. It would be extremely difficult for someone to disappear without being noticed. And why would anyone disappear? But that was exactly the question. Why and how? During the following days, the investigation intensified. Haynes and his team interviewed all the passengers they could locate from train 147. Arthur Pemberton confirmed that he saw Dorothy at the beginning of the trip, but could not say exactly when she left her seat. Sarah Chen said the EEU, same. The Brennans barely remembered her. James Whitmore, the student, was so absorbed in his book that he admitted not paying attention to anyone. Police were sent to each stop along the route: Vergennes, Middlebury, Rutland, Whitehall. They showed photographs of Dorothy, asked station employees, street vendors, taxi drivers. No one remembered seeing her. Catherine Walsh, Dorothy's best friend, was interviewed extensively. She insisted that Dorothy was genuinely excited about the trip, that there was nothing wrong in her life, that the idea of her disappearing voluntarily was absurd. Dorothy planned everything. She is not impulsive. If she did not arrive where she should have arrived, it is because something prevented her, something she did not choose. Dorothy's room was examined. Her diary was read, with Eleanor's anguished permission, who felt she was violating her daughter's privacy, but knew it was necessary. The pages revealed a reflective young woman, sometimes lonely, but absolutely not someone planning to disappear or hurt herself. The last entry, from the night of October 13th, spoke of anticipation, of hope, of a feeling that something good was coming. The Central Vermont Railway conducted its own internal investigation. Every inch of train 147 was inspected. The cars were scoured. Under the seats, in the bathrooms, in the luggage compartments, even in the cargo cars at the back. They looked for any sign of Dorothy, a piece of clothing, her purse, anything. They found nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was as if she had dematerialized. Dorothy's blue suitcase was never found. It was in the upper compartment of Car C when Arthur Pemberton saw it around 11:30. But when the train arrived in Albany and staff did the final check, there was no blue suitcase in Car C. It had also disappeared. How? When? No one saw anyone removing luggage during the trip. The upper compartments were visible. It was impossible to remove a suitcase without at least some passengers noticing. A theory emerged. Dorothy had voluntarily gotten off at one of the stops, taken her suitcase, and gone to some unknown destination. But this did not explain why she had not contacted anyone. Did not explain why she would abandon her parents so cruelly. Did not match everything that everyone knew about her character. Another darker theory. Someone had approached her on the train, somehow convinced or forced her to get off at one of the stops. And then, what? But there were no signs of struggle. No passenger reported any suspicious interaction. Dorothy was sitting alone, quietly. No one was sitting next to her. No one was seen talking to her. Weeks turned into months. The Dorothy Miller case gained regional media attention. "Woman disappears from moving train. Total mystery," screamed the headlines. Newspapers in Vermont and New York covered the story. The FBI was contacted, but, as there was no clear evidence of crime or interstate kidnapping, they offered limited assistance, but did not take over the case. Eleanor Miller entered deep depression. She stopped taking care of the house, cooking, doing anything other than sitting by the window waiting for Dorothy to come home. Richard continued working, but he was a transformed man, silent, somber, visibly aging week after week. Catherine Walsh visited regularly, but each visit was a painful reminder of the friend who had disappeared. Henry Fletcher kept Dorothy's position open for 3 months before being forced to hire a replacement. He kept Dorothy's personal belongings, a mug, some books, a cardigan she kept hanging on her chair, in a box that he kept in his office until his own retirement years later. Gradually, as no new evidence emerged, the investigation cooled. The case remained officially open, but without leads, without a body, without anything tangible to investigate, there was nothing more to do. Dorothy Miller entered the files as an unresolved missing person, one among thousands in the United States, a name in a database, a personal tragedy that the system could not solve. But for those who knew and loved her, Dorothy never became just a statistic. She remained a living absence, a person-shaped hole in their lives, an unanswered question that haunted them every morning upon waking and every night before sleeping. And somewhere, somehow, Dorothy was waiting to be found, waiting for the world to finally discover where she had been all along. Years turned into decades. The 1950s gave way to the turbulent 1960s, then to the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and finally to the new millennium. The world changed in ways that would be unimaginable in 1957. Men walked on the moon. The Vietnam War divided the nation. Technology transformed daily life in revolutionary ways. And through all these changes, the Dorothy Miller case remained unsolved, gradually being forgotten by everyone except those whose lives she had directly touched. Richard Miller never recovered from his daughter's disappearance. He continued working until his forced retirement in 1970 at 66 years old. But he was a shadow of the man he had been. He died in 1976 of a heart attack, at 73 years old. Many who knew him said that he really died on October 14, 1957. It just took 19 years for his body to recognize the fact. Eleanor lived longer, but in a state of emotional suspension that was painful to witness. She kept Dorothy's room exactly as it was. The books on the shelves, the clothes in the closet, even the bed made with the same sheets. Once a week, she would enter the room, dust, and sit on Dorothy's bed for hours. She died in 1989, at 83 years old, in a nursing home, still asking the nurses if they had news of her daughter. Catherine Walsh, Dorothy's best friend, married, had children, lived a life that outwardly seemed full. But she never forgot Dorothy. She named her second daughter Dorothy in honor of the disappeared friend. Whenever she saw a train, she felt a tightness in her chest. Catherine died in 2015, at 86 years old, taking with her memories of conversations and laughter that no one else alive shared. Henry Fletcher, Dorothy's supervisor at the library, retired in 1972. Until the end of his life in 1983, he kept a photograph of Dorothy on his bookshelf at home, a photo of the library staff taken in 1956, showing Dorothy smiling next to colleagues, with no idea that she would have only one more year of life ahead. Captain Robert Haynes, who had led the initial investigation, carried the case as a personal failure until his death in 1981. Among the unsolved cases that haunted him, Dorothy Miller's was always at the top. "She just disappeared," he would say, shaking his head. "On a train full of people. How is that possible?" William Bradford, the conductor of Train 147 on that fateful day, retired in 1985 after 35 years in the railways. He remembered Dorothy, or at least remembered checking the ticket of a young woman in a blue dress. Sometimes, in his dreams, he saw that face in the train window, waving, disappearing. He died in 1992, still not understanding what had happened that day. As those who knew Dorothy personally died, the case transformed from a personal tragedy into a historical mystery. Researchers of unsolved crimes occasionally revisited the case, wrote articles for specialized magazines, speculated on podcasts about what could have happened. The theories ranged from the mundane to the bizarre. Some suggested that Dorothy had carefully planned her disappearance, starting a new life under a false identity. But this did not explain how she would have prepared such a plan without leaving traces, or why she would have been so cruel to loving parents. Others proposed that she had been the victim of a skilled predator who somehow convinced her to get off the train at a remote stop and then killed her. But there was no evidence of such a person, and Dorothy was too cautious to follow a stranger. More fanciful theories spoke of parallel dimensions, alien abductions, or supernatural intervention. These were easily dismissed by anyone with critical thinking. The truth, as would eventually be discovered, was simultaneously simpler and more disturbing than any theory had proposed. In 2010, the Central Vermont Railway, which had operated for more than 150 years, finally ended its operations. The line was acquired by a larger company, and many of the old cars were sold, scrapped, or simply abandoned in rail yards throughout Vermont and New York. One of these cars was Car C from Train 147, the same car where Dorothy had sat on October 14, 1957. Over the years, the car had been repaired, refurbished, and eventually retired in 1998. It sat in a railway depot in Whitehall, New York, along with dozens of other obsolete cars, slowly deteriorating under sun and rain. In 2024, the property where the depot was located was sold to a real estate development company. The company planned to demolish the old cars and build an apartment complex. In June 2024, a demolition team began the work of dismantling the abandoned railway cars. On July 3, 2024, a Wednesday, demolition supervisor Marcus Thompson and his team were working on what had been designated as Car 47C, the depot's nomenclature for what was formerly Car C of Train 147. The car was in terrible condition: broken windows, leaking roof, rust covering much of the exterior. It had been looted over the years, the seats removed, the wiring ripped out by copper scavengers. Thompson and two members of his team, Derek Chen and Lisa Ramirez, were using power saws to cut through the metal structure when Derek noticed something unusual on the back wall of the car. "Marcus, come see this," he called, turning off his saw. There was what appeared to be a false partition, a wall that should not be there. It was covered by decades of rust and dirt, but clearly was not part of the car's original structure. "This is strange," Thompson murmured, examining the wall. He knocked on it with his knuckles. The sound indicated a hollow space behind. Using hand tools to avoid damaging whatever was there, they carefully began to dismantle the partition. It was made of wood and metal panels, that had been welded and bolted from the inside, creating a hidden compartment between the car's visible back wall and the true outer wall. When they finally removed enough sections to see inside, Lisa Ramirez pointed her flashlight into the dark space. And then she screamed. Inside the sealed compartment, in a space of approximately 1 meter wide by 2 meters long and 2 meters high, was a human skeleton. It was partially mummified due to the dry air that had been trapped in the sealed compartment for decades. The skeleton was dressed in the remains of a deteriorated blue dress. Next to it was a faded navy blue suitcase, and scattered around were the remains of a brown leather purse, its contents preserved by the hermetic sealing of the compartment. Thompson immediately called the police. Within an hour, the scene was surrounded by police tape, and forensic investigators from the New York State Police were meticulously documenting everything. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a 48-year-old medical examiner with 20 years of experience, was called to examine the remains. She carefully descended into the compartment, photographing every angle before touching anything. Female, based on pelvic structure, she narrated into her recorder. Approximately 1.63 to 1.68 meters tall. Estimated age at time of death, 25 to 35 years old. Complete skeleton and remarkably well preserved due to hermetic sealing of the compartment. Minimal decomposition, more mummification. The leather purse contained items that seemed frozen in time. A wallet with $47 still inside, a train ticket issued by the Central Vermont Railway, dated October 1957, identification, documents, and a book. An old edition of The Old Man and the Sea. The wallet contained a Vermont driver's license. The name on the license, Dorothy Ann Miller. The news spread instantly. 67-year mystery solved. Body of woman who disappeared from train found sealed in abandoned car, screamed the headlines. Within days, the story was national. Television networks, newspapers across the country, even international coverage. For the few who still remembered the original case, it was a closure that came 67 years too late. Catherine Walsh, Dorothy's best friend, had died just 9 years earlier. Richard and Eleanor Miller had died decades ago without ever knowing what had happened to their daughter. Henry Fletcher, William Bradford, Robert Haynes, all dead, without ever finding the answers they sought. The forensic analysis and reconstruction of what happened took weeks, but eventually the story began to emerge. At some point during the trip on October 14, 1957, between Middlebury and Rutland, Dorothy had apparently gotten up from her seat. Perhaps to go to the bathroom, perhaps to stretch her legs. For some reason that would never be fully clear, she somehow accessed the baggage maintenance area at the back of Car C. This area was not accessible to passengers under normal conditions, but evidence suggested there had been a minor mechanical problem that had caused a door that should be locked to be unlocked. Dorothy, possibly, curious or possibly looking for a bathroom when the main one was occupied, opened the door and entered. Inside this maintenance area, there were several storage compartments. One of these compartments had a heavy door that was slightly open. Dorothy entered. Perhaps she heard a noise and went to investigate. Perhaps she was simply exploring. What she did not know was that the door had a defective mechanism. When she entered and the door closed behind her, possibly due to the train's vibration, she was trapped. The door could not be opened from inside. There was no internal mechanism. It was a maintenance compartment, designed to be accessed only from outside. And by a tragic combination of factors, the noise of the train masking any sound she made, the isolated location at the back of the car, the fact that no one had reason to check that specific compartment, Dorothy was trapped. Analysis of the skeleton indicated that she did not die immediately. There were signs that she tried to escape. Scratch marks on the inner walls, the hands positioned in a way that suggested she pounded on the door. But the compartment was acoustically and physically isolated. On a noisy 1957 train, no one on the outside would have heard. The cause of death, according to Dr. Martinez, was probably asphyxiation combined with dehydration. The compartment had limited ventilation. Dorothy would have run out of breathable air within a few hours, certainly well before the train arrived in Albany. When the train arrived in Albany and went through routine inspection, no one checked that specific compartment. Why would they? It was a maintenance area, supposedly empty. The car continued in service for decades. At some point, probably during a major renovation in the 1970s, the entrance to that compartment was permanently sealed, possibly because the space was considered unnecessary, or possibly because there was a structural problem. The workers who sealed the entrance had no idea that there were human remains on the other side, and so Dorothy Miller remained there in her accidental grave for 67 years. Traveling in a train car for decades, passing through stations where her family had searched for her, rolling over tracks that investigators had scoured, hidden in plain sight, sealed in a space that no one thought to check. Dorothy was finally buried in August 2024 at Greenmount Cemetery in Burlington, Vermont, next to her parents. There was no one left alive who knew her personally to attend the funeral. Some local historians were there, some curious people attracted by the case's publicity, and Catherine Walsh's great-granddaughter, a 25-year-old young woman named Dorothy Walsh, named in honor of Dorothy Miller, although she had never met the woman whose name she carried. The headstone said simply, Dorothy Ann Miller, 1929 to 1957. Found. Rest in peace, finally. The train car where she was found was preserved by the Vermont Historical Society as a somber memorial. Visitors can see the compartment where Dorothy spent her last hours, can read about the case, can reflect on the terrible combination of chance and bad luck that transformed a routine trip into a tragedy. The Dorothy Miller case became a study in how the most improbable things can happen. How a young woman can board a train surrounded by witnesses and still disappear so completely that it took 67 years to find her. How tragedies can occur not through malice or intention, but through a series of small mechanical failures and wrong assumptions that align in the cruelest possible way. There was no villain in this story. There was no predator to be caught, no conspirator to be unmasked. Just a defective door, a curious or confused young woman, and a series of terrible coincidences that conspired to create a mystery that confounded generations. The final analysis of the case revealed several critical points where everything could have been different. If Dorothy had remained in her seat just a few more minutes, if the maintenance area door had been properly locked as it should have been, if the compartment had had a way to open from inside, if someone had checked that area when the train arrived in Albany, if the railway had kept more detailed records of maintenance compartments during renovations, any one of these factors altered, and Dorothy Miller could have lived to old age, could have married, had children, had a full life instead of becoming a tragic missing person statistic. But if is the cruelest word in the English language when applied to past tragedies. Dorothy boarded that train on October 14, 1957, with dreams of learning new things, of expanding her world even if only a little. Instead, her world shrank to the dimensions of a 1 meter by 2 meter compartment, and she died alone, in the dark, probably terrified, almost certainly calling for help that would never come. For Richard and Eleanor Miller, who spent the rest of their lives tormented by unanswered questions, the truth came too late. They died without ever knowing that their daughter had been just a few meters from where they searched for her in 1957, sealed in a car that passed through Burlington several times in the years after her disappearance. The closure that could have alleviated even a little of their pain never came, while they were alive to receive it. For Catherine Walsh, who carried the guilt of not having discouraged Dorothy from making the trip, who wondered for decades if she could have done something different, the truth came 9 years too late. She died in 2015, still believing that the mystery would never be solved, never knowing that in less than a decade, her childhood friend would finally be found and properly buried. The Dorothy Miller case reminds us of several uncomfortable truths: that the world can be randomly cruel in ways that do not involve malign intention, that mysteries sometimes have mundane answers, but no less tragic for that people can be hidden in plain sight for decades, and that sometimes, when answers finally come, they come too late to matter to those who needed them most. It also reminds us of the fragility of human existence. Dorothy woke on October 14, 1957, without knowing these were her last hours of life. She kissed her parents without knowing she would never see them again. She boarded that train with reasonable expectations of arriving at her destination, participating in her conference, and returning home 4 days later. Instead, a series of improbable and involuntary events led her to an end that no one, herself, her family, the investigators, anyone, could have imagined. 67 years is time enough for the world to change unrecognizably. The Burlington of 1957, where everyone knew Dorothy, where she walked to work every morning, where she was part of the community. That city largely no longer exists. The buildings remain, but the people are gone. No one walks the streets of Burlington today and remembers seeing Dorothy Miller. No one enters the Fletcher Free Library and remembers her recommending the perfect book. No one looks at the Green Mountains and remembers Dorothy contemplating them through the library window, dreaming of adventures she would never have. Time erased Dorothy from living memory, leaving her only as a story, a historical tragedy, a solved mystery that serves as a warning or curiosity depending on who is telling. There is no one left alive for whom Dorothy was a real person, not a name in a news story. And there is something deeply lonely about that, about being found decades after everyone who loved you is already gone. The Dorothy Miller mystery was solved. The question of what happened to her finally has an answer. But the answer brings no joy, offers no meaningful comfort, does not undo decades of suffering that her family endured. It brings only a kind of cold, factual closure. Now we know. Now she can be properly buried. Now the case can be officially closed. But for Dorothy, who spent her last hours trapped in a dark compartment, pounding on a door that would not open, eventually realizing that no one was coming, that she would die there alone. For her, the knowledge that someday, decades in the future, her body would be found would have offered no comfort at all. She died in terror and loneliness, and no discovery 67 years later changes that reality. The case remains as one of the most unusual disappearance mysteries in American history. Not because of the complexity of the crime. There was no crime. Not because of the difficulty of solving. Once the body was found, the reconstruction was relatively straightforward. But because of the pure and improbable nature of what happened. The specific combination of mechanical failures, innocent decisions, and cruel chance that had to occur for Dorothy to disappear so completely from inside a train full of people. Statistically, It should not have been possible. Practically, it was almost impossible. And yet, it happened. And Dorothy Miller, a 28-year-old librarian who dreamed of a life a little bigger than the one she had, paid the highest price for a series of coincidences over which she had no control. The desert swallowed Michael Roberts. The train swallowed Dorothy Miller. And both remained hidden until the world changed beyond recognition, until everyone who loved them was dead, until their stories became less about real people and more about mysteries to be solved. The answers finally came, but they came as whispers over long-grown graves, relevant only to strangers who never knew the people involved. And there is something deeply sad about that, about truths discovered too late, about closures that arrive after everyone who needed them is already gone. Dorothy Miller was found, but the young woman who dreamed of adventure, who loved books, who laughed with her best friend Catherine, who organized story time for children, who hoped that train trip would be the first step toward something new. That Dorothy was lost long before her body was finally discovered. Lost the moment a defective door closed behind her in a dark compartment, sealing not only her physical fate, but also robbing her of all the future she should have had. The mystery is solved, but the sadness remains, and it will always remain.